The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. The views, information, or opinions expressed by hosts or guests are their own. Neither the show nor any of its content should be construed as investment advice or as a recommendation to buy or sell any particular security. Security-specific information shared on this podcast should not be relied upon as a basis for your own investment decisions. Be sure to do your own research. The podcast hosts and participants may have a position in the securities mentioned personally through sub-accounts and or through separate funds and may change their holdings at any time.
Welcome to This Week in Intelligent Investing, where we examine timely and timeless investing topics to help you become a better investor. Enjoy authentic, unscripted discussion featuring Phil Ordway, Elliot Turner, and other thought-leading investors, brought to you by MOI Global. And now, here's your host, John Mihaljevic.
Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of This Week in Intelligent Investing. Great to have you with us, and great to have my co-hosts, Phil Ordway and Elliot Turner. With the passing of Charlie Munger, a hero and idol to so many of us, we will dedicate this episode to Charlie, the man, and the legacy. And hopefully we have some, interesting personal insights and lessons to share with you all. So, Phil, over to you to get us started, please.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think we're recording this on Thursday, November 30th. When the news broke on Tuesday about Charlie's passing, I happened to be sitting in front of my computer when the ominous red headline starts flashing on Bloomberg, and of course it caught my eye with the name, and I just kind of saw the news and sat there for a minute to digest what, cannot be reasonably described as a shock for someone who is approaching 100 years old, but still came as a shock somehow. It's just, it was tough to sit there and process that for a minute. And so it's funny. The first thing I thought to do was, I texted you guys, I don't know why, that just felt like a natural reaction. And I called a couple of my other friends that I talk to regularly that I kind of think of as having the same impact on my life that he had with Buffett. And they hadn't seen the news yet. So we just kind of sat there for a minute, and what is there to say, right? I mean, it was a great life, well lived, a long life, well lived. And it was funny too, because as the day went on, I probably had 5 or 6 different people all text me, both to say, hey, did you see the news? And to pass along condolences, even though I'd only met him once kind of in passing and certainly didn't have a personal relationship with him. But, people were kind of passing along their condolences in a sense to me, because they knew how much I genuinely admired him and how grateful I was for all the lessons that he had taught. So I thought that was really funny. I mean, everybody from my neighbor across the street to my mom to people I haven't really talked to that much in the last, year or so, reached out. And I think that kind of speaks to the legacy that he leaves behind. And I think one thing that stuck out to me as I was reading the obituaries that came out was that Jason Zweig, some years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago, asked him, I said, I wouldn't normally ask this to someone, but what would you like the first line of your obituary to be? And Munger took it in stride, of course, and replied that you basically have a duty to be rational, a moral duty to be rational and to be a reasonable human being. And I can certainly say that that's a fitting first line of his obituary, right? I mean, I think that was one of the things that he always did and struck me that stood out over the many years. The other thing that kind of stood out that I think about all the time, I mean, obviously there's tons of little sound bites that we've all taken as part of the catechism over the years, always invert to find your problems, fish where the fish are, all that kind of good stuff that we all take in our day-to-day lives. But, the one thing that I think about on a more intangible but personal level is, in thinking about his life, he always talks about how he's a biography nut, and I like to read biographies too. And I think about his own biography. He actually overcame a whole lot more adversity certainly than I have. I mean, I've had my fair share of lumps in life, and I'm sure most of us could put ourselves at least in that category. And some people could certainly say they've had far more trauma and adversity in their lives. But, he never got to finish college because of World War II. He married young, as most people did, but then in an era when divorce was very uncommon, in his late 20s and early 30s, he found himself divorced, as a single divorced parent of three in the 1950s in Los Angeles was actually not a very common thing, and he was basically dead broke. And then to top it all off, his only son, who was 9 years old at the time, slowly died of leukemia. And I've always thought about how losing a child like that would probably be about the most painful thing a person could go through. And it obviously still got to him. I think he got choked up quite a bit, even in his 90s, thinking back to that, even though he went on to have a very, a large family and by all accounts, a happy and healthy and successful family life. But, I think about that when I've had setbacks or troubles or whatever, and think like, okay, if somebody like that at 30, 35 can be divorced, dead broke, miserable, and lost a son at age 9 to a horrible, incurable illness, like I certainly don't have anything to complain about. And that was another thing that just sort of stood out that I was appreciated, was just absolutely zero self-pity. He later lost an eye and was, functionally half blind and almost entirely blind late in his life, for someone who loved to read as much as he did. And you never once heard a word of complaint or any self-pity in any regard. And that's something I always tried to carry in the back of my mind, for sure. And just it requires kind of constant vigilance to avoid sliding down that slope sometimes. And so I know this is all kind of, it's going to induce some eye rolls, and some people are going to just, oh, great, here's another, person shouting into the void, paying tribute to Charlie Munger. But I thought we just kind of had to spend a few moments reflecting on someone that we all admired, and share some thoughts in light of that. So I'll stop there and open it up to you guys.
Yeah, Phil, I totally agree. Like, forget about the haters. It's worth doing. Munger's an amazing man, an amazing life. And I had saved his quote on self-pity for the last thing I was going to say, but I'm going to start with it because I think it's really powerful. I think, like you said, it's appropriate framing. He lived an amazing life, right? A lot of people are going to focus on rest in peace, but the life was amazing, but it was not easy. And yet, his outlook, I think, was he was a curmudgeon, obviously, as Buffett has told us, the curmudgeon at times, but just an amazing outlook on life. And I think this quote is, generally speaking, envy, resentment, revenge, and self-pity are disastrous modes of thought. Self-pity gets fairly close to paranoia, and paranoia is one of the very hardest things to reverse. You do not want to drift into self-pity. Self-pity will not improve the situation. And I think that's something important for everyone to think about. And I think that gets to his approach to compounding things in life. And you focus on where you can grow and where you can move forward, and always looking ahead. And I think that's pretty constructive, and one of the great things that we could take out of, take away from this great man. I was first introduced to Charlie Munger by a mentor. I'd heard, I was introduced to Buffett and knew of Berkshire Hathaway at a very young age. I'd never known who Munger was until much, much later. And it was when I had gone from finishing law school, thinking about starting a job that was more directly connected to law, and hard pivoting into investing. And a mentor sent me a link to this talk called The Art of Stock Picking. And, I was too dumb at the time to realize what he was trying to tell me was that this stuff is really freaking hard. That was why he sent it to me, because Munger points it out, in his own eloquent way during that talk. But I instantly took to Munger. And my mentor didn't even tell me at first that this was, a lawyer who turned to investing, though I'm not sure if that was coincidence or not. I think that was maybe just, kind of one of those universal coincidences. But I instantly took to concepts like mental models, building your lattice work of mental models, multidisciplinary thinking, which I think was something, I took to all the things that I thought I was bringing to the table, not the things that were telling me this was really hard. But this idea of multidisciplinary thinking, I was like, I was made to do this. This notion of probabilistic thinking that he spoke about during that talk was fairly new to me. I hadn't come from that world, and I mean, I'd been playing a lot of poker, so I was like, yeah, this all makes sense to me. I could pull it all together. And so I started Googling more, and the next thing I read was practical thought about practical thought. And I'd never heard of this concept of inversion, this idea of invert, always invert. And that whole, if you're not familiar with the talk, it's where Munger effectively talks about how you'd build Coca-Cola in reverse. And I was just floored by the idea and how he narrated the Coke story through it all. And I don't know if it was exactly after that as the next one, but the next one that really stood out to me that I'd been introduced to was the psychology of human misjudgment. And I love this idea of social proof, and I think it explains so much of what we see in our world. The whole idea of being rational, I was so glad you mentioned that, Phil. Like, that's our responsibility.
Yep.
So there's so many specific points that I take to, but those were like the three things the early on. And then I just like literally read everything I could about and by Munger, and was like, how did I not know who he was earlier? And one of my biggest regrets is that, before COVID, I was supposed to go to Omaha for one of the, it was going to be in May of 2020 for the Berkshire AGM. And I never actually did get there with both Warren and Charlie together on stage. And, my window's obviously shut now, and it's something that I'll regret, because the influence on me has been strong, both as a person and as an investor. And I feel like, I feel like I've pocketed a lot, though. I've learned a lot from Charlie, and it's like 100 years basically, but still feels too soon.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the psychology of human misjudgment. It was on my list of things to mention too, because on the off chance that there's even one person listening to this who probably stumbled into the wrong podcast searching for something else, but if there's one person listening who hasn't read the transcript of that talk or listened to that talk, it's available on YouTube. There's podcasts that have reproduced it at full length, and there's plenty of written transcripts out there. I think it's probably one of the 10 or 20 most useful things I've ever read or listened to, and it's something I've gone back and reread and re-listened to, it's certainly more than a dozen times, probably more than 20 times. And it's shocking to me how ahead of its time it was, because I believe it was delivered at Harvard in 1994, I want to say, somewhere around there. And it was literally years, if not decades, ahead of some of the major advancements that are now taken as kind of the core and foundation of behavioral economics. And, that was the first thing he said. Well, if economics isn't behavioral, what the hell is it? But at the time, that was not how most of the world viewed it. And it's just an amazing blueprint for how an entire very important field, if you're at all involved in anything related to business, politics, organized groups of human beings, it's something you need to learn and understand. And it's just an absolute masterwork. And of course, it's included in Poor Charlie's Almanac too, which again, I was actually talking to a few people about it who reached out that knew of Charlie Munger and knew of my admiration, but didn't necessarily know much about him. And I recommended that as a great resource. And funny enough, I guess, it's really kind of heartbreaking, but Becky Quick from CNBC was out in LA interviewing Charlie just a couple of weeks ago. And they were preparing one kind of a longer form interview that was going to air in parts around his 100th birthday, which was coming up in just a few weeks on January 1st. He was also preparing a big party for them that I know he mentioned he was looking forward to. But apparently there's also a revised edition of Poor Charlie's Almanac, which I believe she said is due to be released on December 5th. So next week. So that's something for everybody to look forward to, because I'm sure if there's any new material at all, or any updated thoughts or anything, or it's just a collector's edition or whatever it might be, it'll be worth checking out for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned the psychology of human misjudgment talk. I think it's basically fair to say that if you just had taken that talk, wrapped some economic, language around that, you stood to get a Nobel Prize. I
Yeah,
mean,
for sure.
that's, basically, you could have really built a whole career around just taking that talk and expanding on it and adding, the just the way economists, take these things and run experiments and so forth. I think that's one thing. Another really huge legacy of Munger, in my view, is what Buffett has talked about. He's basically credited Munger with moving him from the deep value Ben Graham approach to more of a quality approach. And, we will never know what would have happened to Buffett and Berkshire without that influence by Munger. I also would echo the sentiments on rationality. I think for me, that is maybe one of the biggest takeaways in what I'm trying to implement in my own life. Also, the lattice work of mental models. At MOI, we've kind of used the lattice work brand or name for our biggest event of the year in New York. And, that's basically paying homage to Munger and the idea of interdisciplinary insights and wisdom. I think also the fact, that he's talked so much about reading and reading broadly as being the key to wisdom, to worldly wisdom. So I think, his impact is just enormous on all of us, and I think also on some that may have never heard his name, but they've that wisdom has kind of gone very broadly.
Yeah, I think it has gone pretty broadly. And that was another thing I found so interesting about people's reaction to the news of his passing over the past couple of days. Was you got a couple of, I had put it into like three categories. There were the people who kind of knew what he was all about and kind of knew the story. Then there were the people that had kind of heard of him, like you just said. And that kind of branched one of two ways, like people who were curious about like, okay, well, what was the deal? And then there were people who were very dismissive of like, oh, here's just another like rich white billionaire who must have done something wrong. Like you seem to get that reaction a lot. And I think that's what kind of disturbs me about it, was if you really dig into it, the lessons, like I think that's what I'll miss most, is like I actually don't know. I mean, Buffett obviously himself, but like who's well equipped to take the torch of kind of moral compass and run with it? Like who's going to care enough to write op-eds and give unpaid for talks, and play the role? I mean, yeah, he was a curmudgeon, sure, but he was in my opinion a very good-natured curmudgeon, and was not out, buying, yachts and rocket launches for himself and all this kind of self-indulgent stuff. I mean, he was an enormous philanthropist and he was doing things his own way. But at the same time, he was like kind of that, fatherly, grandfatherly figure that everyone wishes that they have in their life. And I don't know who in American or business life more broadly is well positioned to take that on, unfortunately. I mean, I think that's like a real loss that we're all feeling right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's really hard to imagine who fills in those shoes. There's no like elder statesman, and it's certainly not from the investment world. I think most people in investing don't, I mean, not I think, like people don't make it very long in investing. There are not many people who have like 20 plus year track records, let alone 50 plus years. And it's amazing to reflect on like the returns of the Munger partnership. I was looking those up after I had like been roughly familiar. I'd seen them in the past, but I was like, let me see what those were again after just going down a Munger wormhole the last few days. And his returns were phenomenal. And then the early 70s hit, and it's like 2 straight years of down over 31%.
Yep.
Before a rip-roaring comeback in 1975, and that was like I think when the partnership wound down, and he
that's when he shut the doors. Yeah.
Yeah,
something
but
that stuck with it. It's funny you should mention that. Sorry to interrupt, but like I remember very distinctly, I didn't have quite that kind of drawdown ever, thankfully, but I remember feeling, kind of down in the dumps about a period of underperformance, and remember him thinking that, or him saying that at the time in 1973, 74, when he was having this huge, massive drawdown, which coincided with the bust of the Nifty 50 and just a vicious bear market in the early 70s there, and him saying that, he didn't mind it because he knew that he'd done the right thing, and he knew that he'd avoided all the nonsense, and he knew that his investments would rebound, and he knew that everything would be fine. But he also knew that his partners would, by definition, not feel the same degree of confidence, and that they were going through some real agony while they thought they might be watching a huge chunk of their money evaporate. And he just felt tortured by that feeling that, like, gosh, am I letting my trusted partners down? And it kind of made me feel better in a way, because I'm like, well, if even he felt that way, then it's natural that we all feel that way. And yeah, you wonder too how much it weighed on him, because then, sure enough, a year or two later, he joined Berkshire as vice chairman, had lots of other things going on, but I wonder how much that weighed on his decision to close the partnership. So sorry, I didn't mean to
no
interrupt.
worries.
That's a great point.
And I don't think anyone could do that today. And I think, Phil, I'm surprised you didn't say, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome, right?
Yeah, right.
On this podcast. But I think that's part of like the nature of the incentive structure in the industry, is to like control yourself for volatility. And Munger never would nor could possibly think that way. It was always like, what is the best, most rational thing to do from here? Which I think is pretty amazing. And John, I'm glad you mentioned like the influence on Buffett. Like it's funny, we went through two of us without saying as much, but like this whole notion of the evolution from puffs at the last two puffs on a cigar, but to finding quality businesses that you could hold on forever. I mean, that's something that is in the pantheon of investing today. And yet, without Munger, it might not be as popular nor as prevalent as it otherwise would be. And
for sure,
I feel like Richard Thaler did win that Nobel that could have happened.
Danny Kahneman too, right? I mean, it's
absolutely,
without a doubt. And it's funny you mentioned the comment about, yeah, I mean, it goes without saying. I mean, it's worth reiterating, but it's just so obvious at this point that Berkshire would have never been what it is without his influence. I mean, Buffett is enormously capable, and by Munger's own admission, was the more capable of the two in terms of running and being Berkshire itself. But it would have never been what it is without Munger's influence. And one of the things that somebody asked him recently, again, I think it was from the same Jason Zweig interview a few years ago, was, how have things changed? How are things different? What would you do differently if you're starting over today? And he basically said things were way, way easier back then because there were all these cheap assets with kind of spring-loaded, results just kind of waiting to happen. Lots of excess value below the price that you were having to pay. And you could just kind of wait until the price more accurately reflected reality and then move on. But he, being as hyper smart and rational as he was, noticed that things were going to start changing. And sure enough, was very early, again, years and decades ahead of his time, and saying that, that you need to buy quality, you need to buy good businesses at reasonable prices. And that's a better long-term strategy, particularly as you start working with bigger sums of money, as opposed to just buying bargains and rinse and repeat. And it can't be stated enough. Again, I think Buffett would have figured that out. Likewise, somebody asked him, how much credit Munger should really take. And he said, look, even Einstein needed somebody to talk to. He really thought that his role was giving Buffett a sounding board and being somebody to listen to. It just strikes me again how desperately everybody needs that in life, whether you're Einstein or Buffett or a mere mortal. And, there was a hilarious quote that as I was going back down the rabbit hole, I was in the room when it happened. It was at the Daily Journal meeting in, I want to say 2016 or 17. And somebody asked him, it may have actually been in the kind of the after scrum of the meeting, and said, Charlie, you've said, and I think about it a lot, that you want to hire the guy whose IQ is 130 but thinks it's 120, because the guy whose IQ is 150 but thinks it's 170 will kill you. And without missing a beat, Charlie said, you must be thinking of Elon Musk. And everybody starts cracking up, right? Because And then, it coincided with that bizarre outburst yesterday by Elon Musk at the New York Times Deal Book Conference. And I just remember thinking about it, obviously because Charlie was top of mind, that if Elon Musk had someone even a tiny fraction as capable as Charlie Munger, who could act as his number two to kind of keep him reined in, to be a sounding board, to be a trusted confidant, to be a true partner, he would be so much better. And I think that's true of almost everybody, whether it's a big time, high profile CEO, an everyday business person, a friend, any aspect of life. I think it's just absolutely invaluable. And when you can find somebody who plays that role, you should hang on for dear life.
Yeah, a lot of people think about investing as a solitary endeavor and will point to Buffett without even acknowledging Munger and his role there. It's not a solitary endeavor. Like you need a community around you. You need a sounding board. You need someone, I don't know, to at times be the devil and at times be the angel on your shoulder, because it is an up and down ride. It is a roller coaster, and it helps keep you grounded to have a parallel presence, someone like consistently there that you could consistently talk to. I don't really know anyone in this business, even people who are doing it, pursuing it as like a sole individual firm, who would view it as a solitary endeavor.
No, that's been me, and I certainly don't. I mean, there's a couple of people, and they know who they are, without whom, I call them sometimes multiple times a day, but certainly multiple times a week. And if I hadn't been, I would have A, been less effective, and B, probably lost my mind by now.
Right. And so, it's like such a critical lesson that a lot of people could take from both Buffett and Munger that I think is very often ignored. And I want to talk about like one of the specific things that I really liked on how Buffett defined their investing in the art of stock picking, and he used this analogy of like there are a lot of people out there, and I think he gave that talk. It was like in 1996, maybe, like as the internet bubble was getting going. He's like, there are a lot of people out there investing, like surfing on trends was the phrase he used, or surfing, where you kind of like try to find these waves to ride. And he's like, well, we invest cranky and idiosyncratic. And I just love that phrasing, and I love that thought. And I do think there's something missing about that. And, one of the hard parts about it is like when you try to define your circle of competence, cranky and idiosyncratic doesn't lend itself to a circle of competence, but surfing on trends does. But I kept like asking myself, like, what would be the circle of competence of cranky and idiosyncratic? Like, how would you define it? And it just keeps coming back to just being rational, putting yourself in a position to be thoughtful and identify opportunity. And I think this whole idea of, I think part of why so few people end up doing this for so long is the market does change over time, and there are different styles that come in and out of favor. There are always certain constants, but like every great investor, to be great in a different epoch, has to be a little different, has to invest a little differently. And it's really hard once you pigeonhole yourself to a certain thing, to a certain style. If you're a trend surfer and markets don't trend for a long time, there's nothing you could do. So part of being cranky and idiosyncratic is acknowledging that you yourself have to be different, not just your investing ideas, but you have to be different from one period to another. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that's part of the joy of doing this, being able to like change and acknowledging change and evolving with markets.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point. John, anything else from you that you wanted to add? We've been hogging all the airtime here.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot we could, a lot of threads to pull here. I think, rationality, but it's not just rationality, because, the way Munger has talked about some of the fads that have gone on, or what he perceives as fads, and I would agree, even things like cryptocurrencies, basically, he has indicted people that have made money by essentially, getting the masses, let's say the retail investor, into things that are ultimately bound to hurt them. And so I think there's also a deep sense of responsibility and a moral compass that both Munger and Buffett have had. So it does go a bit beyond rationality, because if you just take rationality, it can be kind of that empty suit metaphor, or some business school graduate, basically a high IQ person, but kind of the dangerous type.
Yep.
And I think so as much as Munger and Buffett have sought to be rational, they also do have, I think, a deep sense of responsibility and what's right and wrong. And I think that's also really important.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought about that a lot too, because one, I think the last thing that Charlie Munger wrote in his own name was just this past February. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, basically saying that the United States should ban all cryptocurrencies because it's a gambling contract with a basically 100% edge for the house, and there's no good that comes from it. And you could argue that the vast majority of the gains from humanity have been because we figured out how to issue stable currencies out of a sovereign entity, and trying to undo that by having this ridiculous thing that's not a currency, not a commodity, and not a security falls into this weirdo gap in the regulations, and it just shouldn't be allowed. And I think that will, as far as I know, maybe he wrote something more recently that I don't know about. He's obviously given a few more interviews as well, but it's kind of amazing that will be the last thing that we heard directly from him. But you're right, John. I mean, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier when I said I'll miss so much having somebody that's lived a long life, that I think you can obviously say has been consistent and rational and stuck to his guns, and has never, been afoul of the law or anything like that. I mean, he's really lived an exemplary way in most regards. It doesn't mean I always agree with him. We'll come back to that in a minute. But one of the things that he always talks about that I think doesn't get as much attention and should is that his number one rule, he's kind of got a few rules, and there's always people throw them around or whatever, but number one rules was don't sell anything you wouldn't buy. And so much of what happens in investing and business, particularly as it pertains to finance, particularly as it pertains to funds, is stuff that whoever's selling it would never buy themselves. And if you just don't do that, the world works so much better, your life works so much better, and it's just such a simple, easy thing. And I think that's what's so interesting. I was thinking about it, again, circling back to the crypto thing. I was listening and reading about some of the FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried trial when he was recently convicted on all charges. And one of the things I found so fascinating, listening to Matt Levine and Michael Lewis talk about it, they had a really interesting conversation together. I think Matt Levine's about as smart as it gets, and has a really good opinion on most of this stuff. And he said, what he really appreciated was that that Sam Bankman-Fried was not a crypto true believer. He was just sort of this ruthless shark that just was doing it because he could do it. Just like you said, I was like, okay, well, this is there and people are willing to buy it, so I'm going to sell it to him. He had no intention of buying this stuff himself, right? I mean, it's not like he was out there evangelizing for it. He was just doing it. And I think that speaks to the dangers of allowing the casinofication, something we've talked about, the casinofication of the market and the economy really take root, and then of course you hear about all these poor people that got, and another Munger thing is you don't blame the suckers at the casino, right? You blame the owners of the casino, and you blame the regulators of the casino, because those are the supposed adults in the room, the people who should know better, the people who should have a moral compass. You don't blame the people that get, literally addicted to pulling the lever on a slot machine or gambling worthless tokens online or whatever the case may be. So something timely from today that certainly sticks out to me.
Even beyond crypto, I think one of the more impressive ones, if I'm recalling the situation right, it wasn't just that Munger didn't like Valiant as an investment. pretty sure he called it like immoral.
Yeah, he did. Oh, for sure. Yeah, he called it a sewer and said it was a deeply immoral company because it was screwing hospitals and screwing patients. And yeah.
Yeah, and it's like amazing how he could instantly like cut through the crap and see it for what it was.
Yeah,
And
100%.
talk about incentives. Like he didn't have to answer to anyone, so he could actually just speak up. And unlike Musk using his kind of like carte blanche to speak whatever he wants, speak up to help people, and lay bare like the realities of what he's looking at that might be cloaked in a certain veneer.
Well, that's what Munger always said, right? Was he wanted to be able to have the independence to not owe anybody anything, right? The opposite of a bought politician, the opposite of a business person who's got to sing the song of his bankers to stay in business, right? That's exactly what he always sought. And I think you could accuse him of a lot of things, but you certainly couldn't accuse him of not speaking his mind from what he truly believed, because that would be truly insane. And that's one of the things that I also found so telling was anytime he spoke out about something that people didn't agree with, I'd be like, okay, great, whatever. But when it came to crypto, basically the only response that you'd hear 99, if not 100 times out of 100 was an ad hominem attack about, him being some stupid old man or a senile old man or some old geezer who just doesn't get it anymore. It was truly just a baseless response, had nothing to do with the merits of the argument and just attacking him for who he is, which is hilarious because you could never turn that around and do the opposite. I think it was really telling that was the response that was almost always coming.
Yeah, it is interesting. The Buffett, there are a lot of Buffett and Munger admirers who are very steeped in the crypto world, that say something along the lines of a younger Buffett or Munger would be working in this space. And I can't prove a counterfactual. Hard to say whether that is or is not the case. But
I can say that that's not the case.
Yeah, I marveled at their ability to evolve with the times. So I wouldn't necessarily think there's a stasis at the heart of it.
No,
There's
definitely no stasis, but I think it just crosses so many lines of things they would just never ever consider, right? I mean, these were again, like they would preach without being paternalistic, right? I mean, they would not cross a line to say, no one should ever use chewing tobacco. They never said chewing tobacco should be illegal, but when they were presented with what Munger described as possibly the greatest business he's ever seen, which was a chewing tobacco business in Tennessee, where they were the only bidder and the price was super attractive and they would have made untold billions from it in, I don't know what year it was. I want to say it was the early 80s. They walked away because he didn't, and Buffett didn't want to be the owners of a chewing tobacco company that was going to, be a net negative for the health of the people who used it. So, that to me is the line they draw, right? And that's, I think, where everybody has to draw that line themselves. But I think the argument that if they were, some ridiculous thing, 40, 50, 70 years younger, they'd be neck deep in crypto is just patently absurd. And it's just people, it falls back into the old dictum. The easiest person to fool is yourself. And I think all those people are fooling themselves.
Well, yeah, I think we've basically, hit the highlights here. I would say to anyone listening who hasn't studied Munger that there's a lot out there to pick up. As I think one of you may have mentioned, there's a new. Is it a new edition of the Almanac coming out?
Yeah, that was just what when the news broke on Tuesday. I went later and watched some of the clips, and they called, or Becky Quick called in to CNBC, and I think she said, sort of just in passing, that there was a revised edition that was set for release. I believe she said December 5th, so just next week. Again, I don't know what's in it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's Stripe Press. It's an abridged edition. I just looked this up when you called it out. I didn't realize it was coming out.
Yeah, it's actually, I know they've been working on it for years. So it's actually John and Patrick Collison from Stripe that sought Munger's counsel numerous times, and I think became quite close with him. And so, yeah, they agreed to take on the publishing of it. So again, I don't know what the content of it would be or what it's going to look like, but yeah, hopefully it'll be out soon.
And any favorite essays you want to call out? I gave a couple. Anything else that we missed on that? Although, we got the big hits for sure.
Well, Janet Lowe wrote a biography some years ago called Damn Right, kind of referring to how Charlie always thought he was right about things and mostly was. I would call that out. Oh, I guess I referred to this earlier and never circled back on it. I mean, I think you do have to be careful, and I think Munger would agree that you never want to go down the path of hero worship. And it's funny. I actually met some years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, someone who literally wrote a book about Munger, and I don't know if he'd want to be named in this regard, so I won't. But I asked him what his personal relationship was like, and he said, "Oh, I've never met him, never talked to him, never want to. You never want to meet your heroes." And I thought that was a little odd. I don't know that I agree with that sentiment, but I certainly agree that you want to be careful with hero worship, because no one is perfect and no one deserves, no mortal being deserves that kind of unstinting 100% credit. And again, I think Munger was as admirable as they come, but there were certainly areas that I disagreed with him or still disagree with him. In particular, he continued through the end, I think, to be far more optimistic about China and far more admiring of the Chinese Communist Party than I certainly am. I always disagreed with his handicapping of the odds of the relative economic and success and political stability between China and India. I just didn't see it that way. I mean, it is kind of crazy too. I mean, he reversed course big time, again, to his credit, in Alibaba, right? I mean, he owned a pretty massive slug of that at the Daily Journal. And I've never done the math as to what the returns or the loss might have looked like. I don't know if he made or lost money on that, but he certainly reversed course, having bought more and then selling it below where he bought the most recent chunks of it. So, again, that willingness to admit mistakes, willingness to be flexible of mind is absolutely key. And so, yeah. And as to your question, Elliot, other stuff that I would call out, he did give tons of talks and lectures, and there's a lot of great stuff out there. If you spend a few minutes on the internet, you'll go down a rabbit hole pretty quickly. Steve Friedman at Santangelo Review put out a great email the other day, I think it was yesterday, with some of the lesser known speeches and articles, all of which I had read before, but maybe a few of them I'd kind of forgotten about or hadn't seen in years. I don't think all of the ones that he sent are actually in Poor Charlie's Almanac, so maybe those will be updated. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, just certainly, create your own anthology on the internet or buy Poor Charlie's Almanac, because that really does cover, 90 or 99.9% of what's out there.
Absolutely. Well said. That's perfect. All of these things worth reading, worth learning from. It's cool to watch him talk too. Definitely some of the speeches are on YouTube as well. And I find the delivery impressive. Like, he could kind of build a story really well.
Oh, you know what?
Like,
I'm actually sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I actually just pulled it up. So yeah, Stripe Press looks like you can pre-order it now, the new edition of Poor Charlie's Almanac, and it's way cheaper, which is super awesome, because the old one was pretty expensive. This one, it looks like, is only $22 and change on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, directly from them, and it does list December 5th, so next week, as the release date. So that's exciting.
Good holiday gift for anyone you know as well.
100%. Yeah, no doubt.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. This was an obligatory episode for us. I think one worth doing. And it's the end of an era. You wonder how, we go from here. And obviously Buffett's still around, but the whole Omaha experience may change a little bit as well. We'll just have to see.
No, for sure, it's going to change 100%. I mean, I will always have great memories of the laughs and the lesson learned from those guys in Omaha together up there. It was something to see for sure.
Well, thank you all for listening. Great to have you with us, and we'll talk soon. Goodbye for now.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.